Welcome to my YouTube channel. To all of you, my subscribers, thank you very much for your support. You guys are awesome. And if you are dropping by for the first time, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and strike the bell notification. That way, you will be the first to know whenever something new comes up. Thank you very much as you do so. Now, in this week's video, we're going to be talking about something very important, and that is interoperability. We're going to be zooming in on IAM, or Identity and Access Management. Now, what are we going to be doing? We're going to be seeing how you can connect to AWS using any third-party identity provider or IDP. Specifically, we are going to be zooming in on how to connect to AWS using Microsoft Entra ID. It promises to be a very, very interesting session. So please stay tuned and watch to the end. I guarantee you that you are going to learn something you probably didn't know before. Thank you very much as you watch on. In this video, we are going to be talking about single sign-ons in AWS. Specifically, we are going to see how to log in to AWS using a third-party identity provider or an IDP. So let's get started. As an agenda, we are going to be talking about what SSO or single sign-on is. We are going to be looking at the AWS IAM Identity Center. We'll talk about SCIM and SAML with Microsoft Entra ID and IAM Identity Center. We'll look at the prerequisites. We'll talk about some of the considerations for integrating these two solutions together. And then we'll conclude before we move over to the console to demonstrate all what we've talked about. So, what is SSO or single sign-on? Well, it is a user authentication process providing the convenience of accessing multiple software systems with one set of login credentials. Now, this can be very important in corporate environments where employees would need to access a suite of interconnected applications. Now, these solutions will work by creating a trusted relationship between the service provider and the identity provider. And when a user attempts to access an application, the service provider requests authentication from the identity provider. If the user already has been authenticated, then the identity provider will confirm the user's identity to the service provider, thereby eliminating the need for additional login attempts. What this does is it streamlines the user experience and also enhances security because it's going to be reducing the number of attack vectors associated with managing multiple passwords. Also, single sign-on can contribute to the reduced IT support costs due to fewer password recovery requests, and therefore it can enhance stronger password policies. So a user will be more likely to remember one strong password rather than remembering several weak passwords. And AWS has support for several identity sources, which includes Active Directory, CyberArk, Google Workspace, Jump Cloud, Microsoft Entra ID, Okta, and OneLogin, just to mention some of them. But in this video, we are going to be demonstrating and we're going to be focusing on the integration between Microsoft Entra ID and AWS Identity Center. So, what is AWS Identity Center? Well, AWS Identity Center is a centralized identity management service allowing administrators to manage users and their access permissions across multiple AWS accounts and applications. What it does is it simplifies the process of granting and revoking access to AWS resources, allowing organizations to manage access at scale. It's got features like single sign-on, and with single sign-on, it enhances security and user convenience because it allows users to access all of their assigned AWS accounts and applications with a single set of credentials. It also supports attribute-based access control, allowing for fine-grained access management based on user attributes and user context. And this is integrated with AWS organizations, providing a unified way to manage access policies across entire corporate structures, streamlining the identity and access management process within the AWS ecosystem. So moving on, AWS Identity Center supports integrations with the Security Assertion Markup Language or SAML 2.0 And this integration allows for single sign-on capabilities, enabling users to access multiple applications with a single set of credentials. Also, the IAM Identity Center extends its functionality by supporting automatic provisioning of users and group information. And this is achieved through synchronization from Microsoft Entra ID, which will be leveraging the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management 2.0 protocol, which is an open standard that is designed to manage user identity information across different domains, simplifying user management in a multi-domain environment. And by utilizing the SCIM 2.0, AWS Identity Center can automate the process of creating, updating, and deleting user identities and group membership. And that's going to ensure that the appropriate individuals have the right access to resources. And this is going to streamline integration between AWS IAM Identity Center and Microsoft Entra ID, which is also going to enhance security and improve efficiency by reducing the administrative overhead which is associated with manual account management. Now, that is a very important step when it comes to interoperability between cloud-based identity management systems, because it's going to be facilitating a more streamlined and a more secure IT infrastructure. So to integrate these two systems together, there are a number of prerequisites. And for you to configure this successfully, you must have a Microsoft Entra ID P1 or P2 license for the Microsoft Entra tenant. You also need to enable the organizational instance of IAM Identity Center within the AWS Management Console, which we are going to be seeing how when we get into the video. And of course, you will need to have the appropriate admin level permissions in both the AWS Management Console and also in Entra ID. So what are some of the considerations we should bear in mind as we begin to wrap up and get into the video, into the practical aspect of this demonstration? Now, when you are setting up a primary email address for users, it is important to ensure that each address is unique. Sometimes identity providers use what is called a user principal name as the primary email. And this user principal name is not actually an email address. If that is the case, then it is important to use SCIM to map the real unique email address to the IAM Identity Center's primary email attribute. Also, the user's unique sign-in identifier has got to be mapped to the IAM Identity Center's username attribute. And if your IDP uses a single value for both sign-in and email, then it can simplify the mapping process to both attributes within the IAM Identity Center. Also, attributes for access control play an important role when it comes to defining permission policies. And these policies are important for determining access privileges within AWS resources. It is important to note that changes in user attribute within Microsoft Entra ID may not always reflect immediately in the IAM Identity Center, especially when an attribute is removed. But updates to the attribute with a new value are synchronized, which is going to be ensuring that access permissions remain current and remain accurate. Also, the Microsoft Entra ID's got limitation when it comes to handling nested group membership. It operates on a direct assignment basis, and what this means is that it can only manage users who are direct members of the selected or specified groups. Indirect relationships such as users within subgroups of the assigned groups are not processed by the service. And for complex group hierarchies, alternative solutions like the IAM Identity Center AD Sync could be a consideration for a more comprehensive integration with Active Directory groups. Now, also, Microsoft Entra ID User Provisioning Service supports dynamic groups, and this can be configured to automatically include users based on specific criteria, such as maybe a role or a department. Now, this capability is especially useful when it is integrated with the IAM Identity Center via the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management. That is because it allows for seamless synchronization and management of user attributes across various applications and services. Now, within Microsoft Entra ID, a tenant can also have up to 500 dynamic membership groups that utilize the member of attribute. And these are included in the overall dynamic group membership quota of 15,000. This ensures that administrators can create groups based on users or device attributes dynamically while staying within the service limits which will be optimizing group management and, of course, access control within the organization. So, in conclusion, AWS has support for several identity sources. Like we talked about, these identity sources could include CyberArk, Google Workspace, Jump Cloud, Microsoft Entra ID. But we are going to be focusing on the integration between the AWS IAM Identity Center and Microsoft Entra ID. Now, the Identity Center, like we also talked about, is a centralized management service that allows administrators to manage users and access permissions across multiple AWS applications and AWS accounts. And of course, there are some prerequisites, such as having the Entra ID P1 or P2 license, having access to the IAM Identity Center, and of course, having admin level permissions. So we are going to be moving into the console now, and we are going to be demonstrating all of those things we've talked about. And of course, there are some additional resources I'm going to be dropping in the link below so that you can get a more detailed information. Please watch on as we get into the more exciting aspect of this, which is the practice. Thank you very much as you do so. So we are in the second part of this video where we are going to be practicalizing everything that we've learned in the presentation part of the video. Specifically, we are going to be seeing how to integrate Microsoft Entra single sign-ons with AWS IAM Identity Center. So what we are going to be doing is we are going to see how we can integrate these two technologies together. So we're going to see how single sign-ons is going to be implemented from the Entra ID side, and we're going to be creating identities within the Entra ID side, and we're going to be using it to log on to AWS IAM Identity Center. Now, before we go on, there are a few things we need to take note of. One of it is the prerequisites, which we talked about. To get started, there are prerequisites, of course. And the prerequisite includes having an Entra ID subscription, which we have. If we go to the overview page of the identity section, we can see that we have the appropriate license here, which is Microsoft Entra ID P2 license. But of course, if you do not have a subscription, you can get a free one, and I'm going to be dropping the link in the description to tell you how to do that. Now, as you can imagine, the next prerequisite will be to have an AWS IAM identity enabled subscription, and to have that, you will need to have an AWS subscription, which we also do. Later on in the video, we are going to also talk about how you can enable the IAM Identity Center. So having talked about that, another thing we need to be aware of is you need to have the prerequisite permissions. And then in Entra ID, you would need to have at the minimum a cloud application administrator permission. In my own case, I have something a bit more than that. I am logged in as a global administrator. But again, you've got to take note that when you are trying to implement things, it's not best practice to always use the roots or super administrator permissions whatever you are doing. Rather, you should be using the principle of least privilege, and you should only use the kinds of permissions that you require. But the minimum here is you need to have at least a cloud application administrator in Entra ID. And then on the AWS side, you need to have admin access to be able to do some of the things that we will be talking about. So we want to get into the nitty-gritty of this, having talked about the prerequisites. We want to, first of all, add AWS IAM Identity Center from the gallery. And then to do that, we will expand identities, which we've already done. We will go to applications, and then we'll click on enterprise application. So the enterprise application console loads, and we can see all of the applications here. We have currently just 4 of them. And if we look carefully, we are going to see that there's nothing AWS related. So we want to go ahead and add that. I'll go ahead and click on new application. It takes us to the Browse Microsoft Entra gallery, and I want to specifically search for AWS IAM, and we can see here that we have the AWS IAM Identity Center, which currently is a successor to AWS Single Sign-Ons. I'll go ahead and click on select it, and it opens the flyout menu here. It gives us a name, and then of course it gives us all of the details here. I just go ahead and accept the defaults, and then I'll click on next. So it takes a couple of seconds to add the application. So once we've added the application, then we'll go and now look at the console again. We're going to see that it has added a 5th application to the 4 that we had already, and then we are going to be moving on to do the next things. So I'll go again and go to enterprise applications, and if I go and do a refresh, we can see here that we have AWS IAM Identity Center added as an application. So the next thing I want to go ahead and do now is to click on the application which we just added. And the next thing we will be doing is we want to go ahead and enable single sign-ons. To enable single sign-ons, I have 2 options. I can click on set up single sign-ons by clicking on the getting started link here, or I can go to the manage area and click on single sign-on, which is exactly what I want to do. So that opens the AWS single sign-on IAM Identity Center single sign-on page, where we have the methods which we also talked about in the presentation aspect. We are going to be using SAML, which is the one we are going to be demonstrating. Notice that there's a disabled option, there's the linked option, but I'm going to go ahead and choose the SAML option right here. So I'll click on it, and again it begins to load. So we have options here where it tells us to do a number of things, but I'm going to just switch consoles to go ahead and download the metadata file, which I'll come and upload right here. So I'll move on to the AWS management console. I'll click on services, and then within the services I want to select security, identity and compliance, and within the security, identity and compliance page I want to go ahead and select IAM Identity Center. So I'll click on it, and it opens the IAM Identity Center. It's loading fully. So we can see here that before we can begin to use the IAM Identity Center, we first of all have to enable it. It tells us that the center makes it easy to connect an existing directory or to use a built-in Identity Center directory to manage user access to AWS accounts and cloud applications. So I want to go ahead and click on enable to enable the IAM Identity Center. Now we see here that it tells us that we've successfully created the organization instance of IAM, and it gives us a code. So now we want to perform some settings in the IAM Identity Center, and to do that I have 2 options. On the left menu I can go under dashboards and click on settings, and then to the right I can go to the settings summary page and still click on go to settings. Either one is going to achieve the same purpose, so I'll go ahead and click on go to settings. Now in the go to settings page we can see that we've got a number of settings here, but specifically I want to go to the lower part of the window and ensure that the identity source tab is selected. Now we have a flyout menu to the right. I'll click on the actions flyout menu, and then I'll go ahead and click on change identity source. Now this opens the choose identity source window. It tells us that the identity source is where we need to manage users and groups, and then we want to use IAM Identity Center to manage permissions for users and groups within our identity source to be able to access AWS accounts and cloud applications. We also see that there are 3 options here. We have the Identity Center directory, which allows us to manage all users and groups in IAM Identity Center. We have the Active Directory option, which allows us to manage all users and groups in AWS Managed Active Directory. But the one that is of interest to us is the external identity provider, allowing us to manage all users and groups to an external identity provider. So having selected that, I'll go ahead and click on next. Now we see now it takes us to the configure external identity provider option right here. And then we will now, there's the metadata file that I talked about, which we would need to use in the AWS, in the Entra ID management console. So I'll go ahead and click on download metadata. It prompts me with a warning. It tells me that it could harm my device. Do I want to keep it? Of course, I say I want to keep it. So I'll go ahead and click on keep. And it goes to download the metadata file. And this here is the metadata file that we want to use. So I'll go ahead and click close to close the window. And then I'll switch back to the AWS Identity, to the AWS Identity Center SAML-based sign-on page of Microsoft Entra ID. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to click on upload metadata file. So I click on upload, and I'm going to browse to the location where we have the metadata file. I'll click on add, and then it adds the basic SAML configuration. Now we can see here that there are lots of parameters that it populates for us. The other option, of course, if you don't have a metadata file, would be to manually impute all of these options. But of course, I usually try to refrain from some of those manual settings because anything that involves human intervention is usually prone to error. So I'll just go ahead and save this, having updated the metadata file to our Entra ID console. So it's saving the configuration, and then of course I'll go ahead and close this, and we can see that the configuration is set. It prompts me to test single sign-ons, but I'm currently not prepared to do that at the moment. So I'll go ahead and say no, I'm going to test this later. So I'll click on no, I will test this later. Now, there's also something we need to download from the Entra ID console. So if we scroll down, to just a minute, the SAML certificates here, we can see that we have an option for Federation Metadata XML, which I want to go ahead and download. So I'll go ahead and click on download, which is going to download that. And like before, it warns me that the file could harm my device. I say, okay, I want to keep it. And this time around, I'm going to be switching to the AWS Management Console, and I'm going to go ahead and upload the Identity Provider metadata. Now, it tells us here that AWS requires specific metadata provided by Identity Provider to create trust. So, like we had before, we have the option of specifying the sign-in URLs and the issuer URL manually. But of course, since I've downloaded the IDP SAML metadata, I'll go ahead and upload this. So I'll click on choose file. And this time around, I'll select the file and click on open. And I'll just go ahead and click on next. And we can see that we've got all of the settings available here. And it tells us to review the following consequences of our requested source change. It gives us a warning. I want to go ahead and accept by typing accept. And then I want to go ahead and click on change identity source. So it goes ahead to perform some configurations, and we are successful here, and we can see that it tells us that we successfully changed the identity source for IAM Identity Center to an external identity provider. So the next thing I want to do from here is to turn on automatic provisioning. Now, when our identity source is set to an external IDP provider, it tells us we can configure how best to provision all of our users and our groups into an IAM Identity Center, and that's going to make assignments to the AWS account or cloud applications that we have configured. I want to go ahead and click on Enable. And then from within the enable, it gives us some parameters here, like the SCIM endpoint and the access token. So I'll just switch back to this console right here. And I want to now go ahead and configure provisioning also in the IAM in the Entra ID Admin Center here, because the parameters I'm going to be picking from the AWS Management Console, I'm going to be adding it here. So it tells us that this is the AWS IAM Identity Center overview. I want to go ahead and get started with the provisioning. So like I had turned on provisioning mode to be automatic in the AWS IAM Identity Center, I want to come to the console here in Microsoft Entra ID and then do the same thing. I'll turn on automatic as well. Now, after I've turned on automatic, it prompts me to impute some specific details. So I'll go first with the tenant URL. I'll go and copy that. That is the tenant URL here. I'll copy it. I'll paste it here. And then I'll go ahead again and show access token, which I'm going to copy, and then I'll come here and paste this. Okay, so now that I've done everything here, I want to be sure that the connection works. So I'll go ahead and click on test connection. So successful, it tells us that the supply credentials are authorized to enable provisioning. I want to go ahead and save. Okay, so we've saved. Now the next thing we want to do is to provision a user which we want to send to AWS console from here. So to do that, I want to go to users. I had already provisioned a user, and I'm not going to run through the details of provisioning a user in AWS or creating a user, because I had already done so in a previous video, which I'm going to be dropping a link to in the description. So if you are interested in knowing how to create a user in Microsoft Entra Admin Console, go ahead and refer to the video. So we've provisioned. The next thing we want to do is we want to manage our users and groups. So I'll click on users and groups. Now, what we want to do here is we want to create, we want to add a user that we are going to be provisioning to be able to implement, to be able to test the single sign-ons in AWS Admin Console. I had already created the user, and we'll just go ahead and add it here. So I'll click on add users and groups. We can see that there is no user assigned right here. And then I'll go ahead and click on the non-selected link, and it prompts us to select a user. I had provisioned the user earlier on called John Doe. So I'll go ahead and select the user. I'll click on select. And then, of course, it tells me to assign the user. I'll go ahead and click on assign. So it tells us that the assignment is successful. Now, the next thing we want to do here is we want to do another provisioning here. And in this case, of course, we want to click on Start Provisioning. And what that Start Provisioning button will do is that it will send the user which you have assigned from the Microsoft Entra ID Admin Center, and it's going to send the user to the AWS Management Console. And then, of course, after that is done, we are going to be moving on to the next step. But so you know, provisioning takes some time. Sometimes, of course, you may want to do an on-demand provisioning. But in this case, of course, since it's the first time, I want to click on Start Provisioning. So I'll go ahead and click on Start Provisioning, and the process of provisioning will start. So we're going to be holding on for a while. Once that is done, we're going to come back and move on to the next steps to be able to finalize what we have started. So please stay tuned. Okay, so we are back to the console. Let's go ahead and do a refresh to see how our provisioning has gone. So I'll click on refresh. And sure enough, we can see that we have one user that has been refreshed here. So we can see that we have one user, we have 100% completion rate, and there are no errors. So to go and see the user, we'll switch to the AWS Management Console. So I'll go to the console, I'll just close this, and then we just want to go to users. So we can see here that without having to do anything in provisioning the user has been replicated into the AWS console. So after we have done that, there are still a few more things that we want to do. So I want to go ahead and add the user to the appropriate AWS accounts. So I'll go and click on AWS accounts. And I want to select the particular AWS account that I want to add the user to. And then I want to go ahead and click on Assign Users and Groups. So I want to go ahead and click on Users and Groups. I want to click on Next. And now it tells me that I should assign permission sets to the organization, which is Outlook.com. There's currently no permission set, so I want to go ahead and create one. So I want to click on Create Permission Set, and then it opens the Select Permission Set type in a different tab. Now, there are two types of permission sets, and permission sets basically will have policies which will be determining the permissions of the users to be able to access the AWS account. Now, there are two types of permission sets. We've got the predefined permission sets, and then we have the custom permission sets. In order to simplify the configuration, I want to go ahead and select the default here, which is the predefined permission set. We can see that we've got different kinds of policies for the predefined permission sets, depending on the kinds of activities that the user will be performing within the AWS Management Console. So we can see here that we've got all kinds of policies, administrator access, billing, and that again is going to depend on what you want the user to be performing within the AWS Management Console. Again, I'm going to go ahead and still say that you've got to be very sure the level of permissions. You don't want to assign too much. Rather, it's better to start small, and then as the user has more responsibilities, then you can go on and grow the permission set. But in this case, I want to keep it simple. I'll allow the administrator access, which will be giving full access to AWS services and resources. I want to go ahead and click on Next. Now, you have to give your permission set a name. It tells us that the name you specify for this permission set will appear in the AWS Access Portal as an available role. Well, to be sure that I know exactly what's going on, I'm going to go ahead and append entra ID to the permission set name. And then we can see all other kinds of settings. We see the description here, which is optional, but again, for best practice, while the description option is there and it's not enforced strictly, I would recommend that you go ahead and always add a description to whatever object or whatever identities you are creating. That way, whosoever picks it up at a later time, or even if you don't work in the organization anymore, is going to know exactly what you were trying to do. This point here gives you the session duration, which gives you the length of time a user can be logged in before the console will log them out. And in this case, it defaults to 1 hour. So we also have the option to add tags. Tags basically are key value pairs that you can use to associate not just with permission sets, but indeed whatever object you have within the AWS console. But in this case, I'm going to just keep it simple, and then I'll go ahead and click on next. So here it takes us to the review screen, and you want to check that everything you've done is the way you expect it. If it is not, you have the edit buttons for step 1 and step 2 that can allow you to go back and change things so that it will be exactly how you want. So I'll go ahead and click on create, and sure enough, our permission set is now created. So we are back to the permission set screen here. We've created it. So we want to go ahead and do a refresh. So now we see the permission set that we created. We want to go ahead and assign this permission set to the user. So I want to go ahead and click on the permission set. I want to go ahead and click on next. And it gives us a review screen here. We can see the user we want to assign the permission set to. And then we want to go ahead and click on submit. So it tells us that we are configuring, and of course it has assigned the permission sets to the user. So we want to move back to our dashboard screen, and then we want to go ahead and test our permission set, and we want to see if the user can indeed log on to the AWS Management Console with the credentials that we created in Microsoft Entra ID. So I'll go ahead and copy the username. You can still notice that the username is the same as the one we created in Microsoft Entra ID. I want to come to the settings summary pane, and we can see here that there is something called the AWS Access Portal URL. So I want to go ahead and right-click this, open it in a new in private window. I want to accept all of the cookies. And you can quickly see here that while we were trying to log into AWS Management Console, what it presents us with is a Microsoft sign-in screen. So I'll go ahead now and sign in with the username. I'll go ahead and also copy the password, and then paste the password here. And then I want to go ahead and click on sign in. So we've put in the username and password, and then of course it prompts us whether I want to stay signed in. I want to go ahead and say no. So I'll go ahead and click on no. And then it signs us in. So we can see here that we have access to the organization here. I'll go ahead and click on the organization, and it prompts us, see, where we can sign in. So I'll go ahead and sign in as the appropriate user. So it signs me in. Okay, and of course we can see that we are fully signed in now into the AWS Management Console, and we have access to all of the resources that we have the permissions to be able to access. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you learned a thing or two. If you did and you found value, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. And of course, if you have any questions or have any comments, go ahead and drop those comments in the description box at the bottom of the screen. So thank you very much for watching, and keep a date with us next time. Bye for now.